I want to. We've had some audience questions around supply chain, and I had a supply chain question or two as well. So I want to spend the remaining time that we have maybe talking about supply chains. I like to be as deferent to the audience questions as possible, and we've had a couple of them. So I'm going to pose those to both of you. Jim asked, Operation Warp Speed cleared the way to obtaining critical supplies and raw materials. Do you have any tips to manage supply chain resiliency to manage a surge in demand? And then related, Pratik asked, beyond surge specifically, any guidance from the panel on best practices or approaches for building supply chain resilience across drug modalities? So both of those are sort of asking the same question in two different concepts, like one, managing supply chain resilience during a surge, and one, like, what have we learned from this incredible demand that can help us better manage supply chains even in quote unquote normal times. Zoltán, since you're on my screen, I'll maybe start with you.
Sure, that's a very important question, right? Because you need multiple components to make these vaccines, and you need a supply chain to be in place for that. So I think what we've seen is that this was a new technology at the time, right? The RNA platform technology, and many of the raw materials for this technology have been not really scaled up before the pandemic because there was no product before and there was no need for scaling these up. Now these have been scaled up and there are multiple suppliers that can provide some of those components. So that's positive, but probably even now, if there was, so everyone's producing based on what the current demand is, right? If there's another pandemic, when the demand really goes up again for some vaccine product, for example, I think the supply chain will be again stretched, and we probably won't have enough components, raw materials, enzymes, and so on, consumables, chromatography consumables, filtration consumables, and so on. Everything will be again undersupplied and not meeting the demand, right? So I think we need some kind of an approach to have almost like a surge manufacturing capacity on the supply chain as well, if you will, so that you can make all of these components in a way that you can then use them to make actually the product that is meant to overcome an outbreak or a pandemic, right?
Yeah. Do you have thoughts on that? And Kayla, I welcome you to jump in here too. That initial question, and also sort of the follow up, what the vision looks like to enable that, a surge supply chain environment. We talked a lot, I think, during the pandemic about shortfalls in geographic proximity. In fact, to consumables and raw materials. So there was there were a lot of people talking about nearshoring and bringing production back to domestic soil, wherever your domestic soil might be. And then on the flip side of that, there was a lot of discussion around needing to improve technologies of the finished product so that we could make that last mile supply chain more tenable for countries that are distributed and underserved. So I guess the question is, what are your thoughts on some of the fundamental elements of making that supply chain resilience happen?
I think there was changes too during COVID of like switching from ocean freight to air carriers and even smaller carriers to move things around quicker. That's definitely something that was a bottleneck. And then looking at the supply chain as a whole, having greater chain visibility across globally. I think that's kind of something. It might be between site to site if they talk, but not really farther than that. And some sort of, we talked about like automation, but even, as we get more robust in robotic process automations or AI, things like that, definitely, I think have a big improvement to at least be looked at this early phase, hoping, we don't hit a pandemic right away again. But as you said, like centuries, or a couple decades or something like that, if you can start looking into new technologies to help these supply chains talk to each other, that's definitely one way. And then how they get to each other, right? Cargo and freight. I think that was a huge bottleneck. Talked about Operation Warp Speed. I remember like having like an escort to get like, some sort of like valves and stuff to the site. That was a huge help from the government, but it definitely doesn't help if you could maybe have site to sites talk and see that there was, demands closer or farther. So those were kind of my initial thoughts, that I'm not sure how much is being looked at, but any sort of automation or chain visibility and efficiency and those kind of things is definitely going to help down in the future.
Yeah, I think that speaks to another question that popped up just a minute ago around pressures to get pricing down. David asked, what are some answers to get supply chain costs down? Will they inevitably go up, or as demand increases, will the supply chain diversify and decrease expenses? David asked that, and it's boy, anyone who wants to look into the crystal ball and think about inflation, cost, and supply chains right now, and go on record with responses, I give a lot of credit to. That's a really tough one to address at this point. We'll come right back to that in a second. I've got one more polling question I want to get to before we wrap things up here. So we just previously asked which technologies you're currently using. This one is asking, what in-house equipment or technologies would you consider necessary to support critical surge manufacturing needs? Perhaps, not what you're running right now, but what you're short on or you find necessary. Single use, configurable, movable process trains. Not applicable, we currently outsource. Complete modular building units, partial modular spaces such as clean rooms or other aseptic fill finish process robotics equipment, or some level of automation or others. So just take a minute to hit your responses on that. We'll take a look at those responses here shortly. But Zoltán, I just kind of glossed over this question around supply chain costs and demand increases, either resulting in a positive influence on supply chain efficiency and costs, or whether those expenses will continue to climb. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like as you do the modeling work that you're doing at Wellcome and kind of building out this resilient manufacturing environment, what influence does the supply chain play into what you're envisioning?
Yeah, there's not an easy answer to that, but generally I think the trend that we would expect to see is that cost of these raw materials would decrease, because for several reasons there's going to be more suppliers coming online, right? That can just have more capacity, and cost will go down. But there's another interesting element there is around the IP, and some of these materials and components have patent protection, right? And then they have some companies have the right to commercialize them at almost any cost, basically, right? So, but then the innovation of other companies that are developing better components, right? So it's kind of like an interesting one. It's hard to predict, but generally, I think that in the long term, costs will go down just because then competition, right? And there's more suppliers coming on the market.